Maya's evenings followed a predictable routine. After a long day at work, she'd board the same bus, sit in her favorite corner seat, and stare out the window, letting the city lights blur her exhaustion. It was the one part of her day where she could let her mind drift, disconnected from the monotony of everyday life. That evening, Maya noticed the bus was emptier than usual, just a handful of passengers scattered across the rows. She slid into her usual spot, grateful for the solitude. At the next stop, a man stepped onto the bus. His movements were slow and deliberate. He wore a long, gray coat despite the humid weather. Something about him felt off. He didn't glance at the driver or the other passengers. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and fixed on the seats. When he stopped directly across from Maya, she froze. The bus was nearly empty, yet he chose the seat facing her. She tried to act indifferent, staring out the window, but her reflection betrayed her unease. She could see him in the glass, sitting unnaturally still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Maya's pulse quickened as she dared to glance at him. He was staring at her, his face expressionless, but his eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. The bus rolled to the next stop, and a few passengers exited, leaving the two of them alone in the dim, flickering light. Maya gripped her bag tightly. She could feel his gaze, unrelenting, like it was pressing down on her. When the bus finally approached her stop, she bolted from her seat before it fully came to a halt. Her feet hit the pavement, and she walked quickly toward her apartment, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. She glanced over her shoulder, and there he was. He was following her. "Hey!" Maya called out, her voice sharper than she expected. "Why are you following me?" The man stopped, tilting his head slightly, as if the question didn't make sense to him. "I've always followed you," he said softly. Her stomach turned at his words. She didn't recognize him. At least she didn't think she did. His face was unremarkable, his features forgettable, but there was something about him that made her skin crawl. She turned and hurried up the stairs to her building, slamming the door behind her and bolting it shut. Her hands trembled as she flipped on every light in her apartment. For the rest of the night, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching her through the walls. The next day, Maya convinced herself she'd overreacted. People walked in the same direction all the time. It didn't mean anything sinister. But as she boarded the bus that evening, her chest tightened. She scanned the seats, half hoping, half dreading that the man would be there. He wasn't. Relieved, she settled into her usual seat. But as the bus rolled through the city, something nagged at her. The seat across from her wasn't just empty, it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be. The following night he returned. This time, he boarded the bus at her stop. Maya's breath hitched as he walked down the aisle and sat across from her again, just as still, just as unblinking. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't speak. He didn't follow her off the bus that night, but his words from before echoed in her mind. "I've always followed you." Maya began noticing small, unsettling things in her daily life. The sense of being watched lingered, even at work or in the safety of her apartment. She started waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced someone had been in the room. One evening, she decided to stay late at work, hoping to avoid him. But when she finally left and boarded the bus, there he was. Same seat, same unnerving stillness. Maya couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" For the first time, he moved, leaning forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You see me now," he whispered. Her blood ran cold. That night, Maya didn't go home. She checked into a hotel, hoping distance would break whatever spell the man had over her. But when she turned on the television in the room, her heart stopped. The news anchor was reporting a story about a local bus driver who had gone missing a decade ago. The image on the screen was unmistakable. It was him, the man in the gray coat. Maya's mind raced. How could it be him? She'd seen him, touched the same bus he rode. Yet the report claimed he'd vanished without a trace. She tried to piece it together, but her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. The hotel staff found Maya's room empty the next morning, her belongings untouched. Weeks later, a new passenger started taking the bus, a quite young woman who always sat in the same corner, and across from her, the seat remained empty. Yet, in her reflection, if you looked closely, you could see the faint outline of a figure sitting, watching, and waiting.